So modifying cars is something we are all too familiar with. Some of us do it to make our cars faster, some of us do it to look cooler, and some of us do it to sound better, or any combination of any of the above and more. So there's this old joke about the first race occurred just shortly after the second car was built. But when did we start modifying vehicles? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a brief history of modifying cars. So the year is sometime in the 1920s, and a bunch of classy, well-behaved gentlemen started stripping down their very early model cars from Ford to go faster with less weight. Psych! These guys were bootleggers, good old-fashioned cops and robbers running from Johnny Law, making the car as fast as they could with what they had available, and that is the birth of hot rodding. It goes all the way back to evading the law, and I'm sure shortly after, it was the cops trying to do the same to keep up with the Dillingers and fellow bootleggers, bank robbers, and the like. Soon after, the 1920s and 1930s hood rats evolved with the modification of cars to make them go slightly faster by stripping things down. I'm sure there were lots of curious people who wanted to make their cars go faster for other reasons, and in the 30s, they opened the Bonneville Salt Flats.
The Bonneville Salt Flats are a hot rod paradise. 200 amateur drivers turn up with their homegrown speedsters for the 3rd annual National Speed Trials.
That's right, the Bonneville Salt Flats are that old, and they realized they had a lot of space, and they could use this space to figure out how to make cars go faster. So the scientists, the can-doers, the DIYers, and just people who are genuinely curious and fascinated with the automobile from an early time started figuring out how to make cars faster.
Last year, the winner here was clocked at 210 miles per hour. No wonder they have the race on the Salt Flats.
The next big change in automotive culture and modifying as a whole wouldn't come until after the Second World War. Now, I don't have a World War II era outfit, so you just have to imagine it. PD, if you can work some magic. Anyways, soldiers came home to America from World War II with a bunch of newfound mechanical skills and a penchant for innovation. It didn't take long before hot rodding took the next big significant turn in the cultural landscape. It wasn't long before garage projects began seeing themselves in pop culture. The first hot rodding magazines were born in the 40s, and before the 1950s kicked off, NASCAR was up and running. Not too long after that, drag racing took hold, and the NHRA, as we know it today, was formed in 1951. By this point, motorsports was up and running across America, and custom car culture began to take hold as early as the 50s and 60s. Trailblazers like Ed Big Daddy Roth and George Barris were leading the charge in custom car culture, and that probably shaped more custom car hot rod culture than any figure before them at this point. This is where things got wild with bodywork and wild paint jobs and engine transplant. This was the start of real hot rodding as we know it today. Around this time, the Grand National Roadster Show and Detroit Autorama became mainstays in car culture where people could showcase their custom car builds, and soon enough, it hit the mainstream. Around this same time, Mexican-American youth on the West Coast were building lowriders. The very first lowriders came out around this time, and they were the antithesis to what was going on in America at the time. Instead of bigger and faster, these cars were lower and slower with some of the wildest paint jobs and custom work at the time. Now, of course, that is just what's going on in America. Across the pond at the same time, the Europeans were modifying their cars for rally and touring car championships. BMW, Mercedes, Porsche, even Fiat became mainstays for the motorsports going across Britain. The British Touring Car Championship was launched in 1958, making it one of the oldest motorsports championships in the world. Now at the same time in Asia, Japan was recovering from the devastating effects of World War II, and cars became more mainstream affordable. All of a sudden, Japan had a love affair with cars as well. Largely inspired by what was going on in America and American modification culture, they began modifying the style and performance for the cars as they saw fit, and it wouldn't be long before they discovered something very near and dear to Japan. More on that soon. So the 60s and 70s are probably the most transformative time in all of automotive culture, and this one's going to take a little longer, so buckle up. First of all, in America, this ushered in the muscle car era, probably the most iconic thing to ever happen to manufacturers, as manufacturers realized the performance demands of all the hot rodders of years past and began to offer it themselves. Big V8 coupes, stylish bodies, performance, loud engines. This is what it was all about. So things like the Ford Mustang, Pontiac GTO, Dodge Chargers and Challengers, and of course the Chevy Camaro offered lots of performance on tap, and this didn't dampen modification culture. In fact, it fueled it. Having access to a faster car meant you could make them even faster and even better looking with a little bit of wrench turning. In Europe, the 60s ushered in something completely different. Kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, this was the era of the Mini Cooper. If you look back at Mini Cooper's accolades from the time in motorsport, it is truly shocking. I invite you to look it up. They won just about everything they entered in because they learned relatively simple mechanics, small cars, tighter turning radius, a lot easier to go faster with a couple modifications, especially when it came to road courses and rallies and things like that. As the influence of American racing culture took hold in Europe, it grew to a critical mass in British touring car racing, and all of a sudden, home DIYers were modifying their cars to look just like the British Touring Car Championships and DTM racers of the era that they knew and loved. Now, while the Americans and the Europeans were focused on going as fast as possible while adding the best possible handling and the most power they could to cars, Japan was on a slightly different path. They had discovered drifting. Now considered much more entertaining to the Japanese at the time, the origins of drifting can be debated. There was a Ferrari driver, Tazio Nuvolari, who was credited as being the inventor of the four-wheel drift, or Stirling Moss was steering with the accelerator pedal through corners, but it was famous motorcyclist turned driver Kunimitsu Takahashi, hope I said that right, who's said to have pioneered many of the drifting techniques we know and love today. This era in Japan also gave rise to the Bosozoku, the infamous motorcycle gangs who quickly turned to modifying cars in the same wild and loud style that they had modified their bikes in the past. These outlaw racers went for big chin spoilers, wide bodies, big wheels, big kits, big wings, exhaust pipes taller than the car. You know what I'm talking about, the Kaido Racer. One of the most iconic transformative periods in automotive culture to date that still inspires some of the trends we see today. Now, Kaido racers and the like also gave birth to the term shakotan, which literally translated means low car, often referring to a slam car with a low offset wheels and stretch tire setup. Now, up until the modern era, this was the most significant growth in aftermarket automotive ever to happen. At this time, SEMA was launched in 1967 as aftermarket companies with lots of technical experience began offering aftermarket parts. Towards the late 70s and early 80s, wild and extreme was the go-to for modifying car culture. Visions of porthole windows and shag carpets and crazy airbrushed flaky paint jobs come to mind when we think of things like custom van culture, which was adored by both the hippie crowd and the rock crowd of the time. Everyone could enjoy a custom van with all the work done to it in whichever style you prefer. And the widespread availability of V8 engines from the factory gave way to a lot of engine swapping. While some cultures were focused on adding handling and aerodynamics to small cars, America was about cramming big V8s into big brick cars and going fast and loud. What the f is a kilometer? As you can see, the widespread availability and the growth of the aftermarket car scene and hot rodding as a whole led to a huge demand for more car shows and competitions and motorsport events across this time, and this birthed countless subsects and niches of car culture. The big-wheeled, big-box Chevy donks of the South, the lowrider scene that seemingly exploded during this time, dedicated dragsters that could drive on the street, mild-to-wild hot rods, it was all coming to a head. Motorsports events were in high demand, and there was absolutely no putting this genie back in the bottle. The late 80s and early 90s brought an entirely new dimension to car modification. Japanese automakers started churning out instant classics over and over again in the wake of Japan's economic boom. Nissans, Toyotas, and Hondas became mainstays as import tuner culture began to grow across the world. Honda Civics, Toyota Supras, Toyota Celicas, Nissan Skylines, 240s, and more took hold of enthusiasts who could look past their small exteriors, especially those who already knew how the Minis of Europe performed with some slight modification. The import tuning scene could be characterized by a focus on balance, a combination of suspension upgrades, turbocharging, and aesthetic modifications inspired by motorsport were mainstays of the JDM tuning scene. JDM fever was in full effect by the mid-90s, thanks to the Japanese automakers releasing cars that were so far ahead of their time and served as a great outlet for enthusiasts who wanted the opposite of the American muscle cars. At this time, drifting was in full swing, no pun intended, around Japan, be it at the raceways or on mountain roads in the middle of the night, and the circuit racing scene in Japan was booming. The Japanese aftermarket as we know it today grew exponentially over this time period and cemented brands that we still know and love today as figureheads of performance and style. Video games, movies, magazines, and pop culture took immediate notice of the potent potential of these small Japanese cars, and a lot of tuner mags were born around this time, including our beloved Fast Mag in 1999.
I live my life a quarter mile at a time. For those 10 seconds or less, I'm free.
The Fast and Furious series brought immediate mainstream attention to import tuners, and the floodgates were open. Street style and automotive style combined forevermore, and this was probably the biggest boom in pop culture automotive scene we had ever seen before. Amid international influence and mainstream explosion, the desire to stand out at car shows with cars became insane. This is what gave birth to some of the wackiest body kits we've ever seen, insane paint jobs, full speaker setups. I'm talking the most ridiculous modifications you could throw at a car. You've seen them, you know exactly what we're talking about. At this time, Volkswagen's compact Golf became increasingly popular because of the rise of the import tuning scene. A small car with lots of potential was all of a sudden a favorite daily driver for many enthusiasts. Europeans were also experiencing the rise of the German tuning scene. Brands like AMG and Brabus and AC Schnitzer all played parts in bringing these fine-tuned mechanical machines into the OEM Plus era of performance and style. Around this time, European boy racer culture emerged, with young enthusiasts causing mayhem on the streets of Europe. This typically took place in modified Subarus, Ford Focus, Vauxhalls, you name it. These guys were sending people insane. Thanks, Fast and Furious. Our friends at Garrett Turbos launched turbocharging for motorsports applications into the stratosphere when they debuted the first ever ball bearing turbo for motorsports in 1993 at the 24 Hours Le Mans and dominated. Turbocharging small engines became all the rage by the late 90s, with high-flowing aftermarket fuel injection more readily available, and gone were the days of relying on turning up fuel pressure alone. Now, enthusiasts could reliably turn up air and fuel pressure together and make that turbo spin. Those that were a little more tech-savvy got busy with ECU chips, reflashes, and even piggyback systems, anything to prevent the OEM car computer from throwing a fit, lighting up the dashboard, and sending the vehicle into limp mode with the added power and modifications. This was the beginning of something special. As we moved into the 21st century, the digital revolution began to shape how we modify our cars. Advanced tuning software, much more complex ECUs that needed to be jailbroken or unlocked, and electronically controlled drivetrains completely changed the game. Luckily for would-be DIYers, the plethora of online resources was also readily available at this time, and people were learning to unlock these things themselves. This gave birth to the widespread growth of ECU tuning and tuning shops as we know them today. The digital age also brought the rise of social media, which served as a great way for enthusiasts to share information and learn more. All of a sudden, modifying cars and doing a little more complex tasks became a little more accessible if you had the technical know-how and were willing to put in the hours. The rise of social media also gave way to attention builds. This is where big wide body kits, exposed hardware, excessive camber, all of that stuff, the flashiest, the most weird looking, that had its moment in the spotlight for better or for worse. Anything to grab attention was quickly used. As you might have guessed, we are of course arriving at the segment where we talk about EV tuning. It is an emerging trend today and probably one of the fastest growing segments in the automotive world. Gone are the days of using EVs strictly for efficiency. There are now ways to modify their looks, their performance, and so much more, and some of these things are damn fast. As enthusiasts go through a broader societal shift, they're looking at ways to keep the hot rod and tinkerer spirit alive when it comes to EVs. Friends like Scalar Performance and Mountain Pass Performance are leading the charge on making electric race cars and electric street cars that we can all enjoy. The accessible and seemingly easy nature of tuning EVs or swapping EVs has led to a wide growth in these modernized swaps. So you'll see 60s, 70s, or even older cars swapped with EV drivetrains. We've seen lots of those at SEMA. That is a new version of hot rodding. And as EV tuning or hybrid vehicle tuning continues to evolve, we hope to see the same spirit of the bootleggers and the hot rodders continue into the future. The history of car modification culture as we know it is a testament to human creativity, ingenuity, and of course, our love for cars. From the 1920s bootlegging hot rodders from the past to the digital age tuners of tomorrow, we love to see the tinkering spirit continue as each generation leaves their mark on this culture. As technology and taste continue to evolve, so too will the ways that we decide to alter our vehicles and our methods of transportation. And as we move forward, we hope to ensure that the hot rod spirit stays alive in this tinkering world.